In today's episode of Sunday School, I talk about a challenge to the moral argument for God's existence, specifically dealing with whether or not empathy is in and of itself a sufficient moral standard and thus one that renders God obsolete. Now, before I get into empathy specifically, I want to talk briefly about what the moral argument for God's existence is. Specifically, it is a philosophical argument that if the premises of the argument are correct, the conclusion logically follows from those premises. And the premises for this particular argument there are two of them. The first premise is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. The second premise of this argument is objective moral values and duties do in fact exist, and thus the conclusion is God does exist. Now, before we can properly understand the moral argument and its implications, we first have to understand what is meant by the term objective here. Specifically, objective in the context of the moral argument refers to something that is true regardless of whether you agree with it or not, or whether you even are aware of its existence or not. A good example of this concept would be gravity, because gravity is something that affects you regardless of whether or not you like it, dislike it, or even are aware of its existence. Like, you could walk up to a cliff and be like, man, what's this gravity mess I keep hearing about? It's a bunch of BS. Well, if you walk off that cliff, you're still going to get pulled to the ground, because that's just how gravity works. It's a real objective thing. In contrast, subjective refers to something that is subject to the individual person. So subjective would be something like an opinion or a personal experience or maybe even a dream. Basically something that you believe and you perceived, but either no one else would be able to verify is true, or something that no one else has experienced. So now that we have a better understanding of the terms objective and subjective, let's get back to the moral argument. Now, recall that the first premise of the moral argument for God's existence is that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. In other words, if there is no God, then while people could still believe that something is good or bad, that wouldn't be true in any objective sense. That would just be the individual opinion or societal opinion. There's nothing real about it except that people believe that to be the case. It also means that there'd be nothing obliging us to abide by those views. Even if we as an individual believe something that is good or bad, or society believes something that is good or bad, there's nothing that would obligate us to act or not act in certain ways in accordance with those views. Now, one of the challenges to this premise that I have heard is the claim that, well, we don't actually need God to provide an objective standard for morality, that we do have a standard that is valid and binding on us regardless of whether or not we believe it, and that standard is empathy. So that begs the question, can you actually use human empathy as an objective moral standard? Now, the answer to that question is an emphatic no, and there are a few reasons why this is the case. The first, and I think most obvious one, being that empathy is not a standard of any kind. Empathy is a tool that we as human beings have. And to dive a little bit deeper into that, let's take a look at what psychology today has to say about what empathy is. Empathy is the ability to recognize, understand, and share the thoughts and feelings of another person, animal, or fictional character. Developing empathy is crucial for establishing relationships and behaving compassionately. It involves experiencing another person's point of view rather than just one's own, and enables pro-social or helping behaviors that come from within rather than being forced. So based on that, empathy just means that I, as a human being, have the capability to understand and experience someone else's point of view, thoughts, feelings, or what have you. It doesn't say anything about whether or not those thoughts or feelings or perspective are valid or correct or even helpful. So to kind of unpack this a little bit, let's imagine a hypothetical where you have come home and you catch another man sleeping with your wife. Now, most of us, I think, would be understandably very, very angry if we caught our significant other cheating on us. And we can empathize with the husband who has just been cheated on and see how he might be angry, very angry, perhaps even angry enough to hurt or kill the man that he just caught cheating with his wife. However, we could also empathize with the cheating man, at least in the sense that, we probably would not want to be murdered, generally speaking. So we're capable of empathizing with both of these people and feeling what they feel and seeing both of their perspectives on it. But what empathy doesn't do for us is tell us which, if either of those perspectives, is right. It doesn't tell us anything about how we ought to react in those situations. It doesn't tell us which perspective we should prioritize over the other one. Empathy doesn't tell us which of those feelings or perspectives should be prioritized, except to the extent that we feel one set of emotions or understand the perspective of one person more so than the other. And even in such cases where we more strongly feel or identify with the perspectives of one person versus another person, what obligates us to act or not act on those feelings? The answer is nothing. We as human beings have the capability to act or not act on any feeling that we have or that somebody else has as we see fit. So because empathy does not innately tell you which set of perspectives or feelings that you should prioritize or view as more important, or whether or not you should act on the feelings that you're experiencing, you, by necessity, would have to appeal to a standard outside of just sheer empathy to determine what would be right or wrong to do in any given situation. Now, some might attempt to define empathy a little bit differently and say basically, well, what I mean by empathy is the feelings of guilt or compassion we feel as a result of doing certain things or encountering certain situations. And that doesn't really quite encompass what empathy is, but for the sake of argument, let's go with that sort of definition. Let's say, for instance, that we run into a situation where we are forced to kill someone in self-defense. Now, it's very common for people to feel guilt and remorse at doing so, but at the same time, most of us would acknowledge that they did nothing morally wrong, that they were absolutely right to do what they did. And we have good reason to acknowledge killing someone in self-defense as being morally right, or at least morally permissible, as the Bible actually endorses such a view. If you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verse 2, that verse talks about a law basically saying that if a thief robs your house at night, the implication being that because it's at night you wouldn't be able to see and they could potentially be a threat to your life, that if you killed them, you were not considered to have done anything wrong. And a New Testament example that backs this idea up would be the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 36, where Jesus basically tells the disciples to go by swords. Now, while that doesn't directly say that killing someone in self-defense is okay, it doesn't seem to make much sense for Jesus to tell his disciples to go buy swords unless being able to use them for their intended purpose, which is defending yourself, was permissible. So if we're going simply on feelings of guilt or remorse about something, that would be wrong, which would have meant that the right thing to do in that situation would have been to just let the guy kill him. That's just one example of a situation where we can see that just going off of innate feelings of guilt or remorse to determine if an action was right or wrong just doesn't work. Some other examples might be punishing your child for misbehaving, breaking off a relationship, having to exhibit some tough love toward a friend or family member, and telling them something that is not going to be pleasant for them to hear, but they need to hear in order for them to correct a self-destructive behavior. All of those things are likely to make us feel guilty or bad or anxious or whatever, but still, most people would acknowledge that those would be good things to do. Finally, a major reason why empathy cannot be used as an objective moral standard is because we don't all exhibit empathy to the same degree. Now, as human beings, we all, generally speaking, have an innate capacity for it, but it is largely a learned behavior. Furthermore, the literature shows that there is actually a difference in the level of exhibited empathy between men and women. A 2014 study published in the Neuroscience Behavioral Review basically makes this claim in the very first sentence of its abstract. Evidence suggests that there are differences in the capacity for empathy between males and females. And if you go on to read the study, basically it talks about how these differences are present at basically all stages of development. So while some of it might be cultural, it's largely innate. It's largely biological. So looking at empathy in its totality, the fact that it varies between men and women alone means that it's not usable as an objective standard, because there's already a situation where it's not going to be able to be applied equally because men and women don't exhibit it to the same degree. You add that to the reality that it already, even on an individual basis, doesn't tell you how to prioritize a particular set of emotions or thoughts or feelings over another set of emotions or thoughts or feelings. Then you combine all that with the fact that although empathy may allow us to experience the emotions and perspectives of another person, it doesn't obligate us to act in any particular way in response to those feelings or perspectives. So while you could try to argue that there are other foundations for objective moral values and duties besides God, you would at the very least have to admit that empathy is no such foundation. All right, everybody, school is out for this week. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to like it, leave a comment, share it with your friends. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Liberty Ambassador. I have a little bit of other content about theology and apologetics. I hope to expand that going forward, and I have several videos giving my political takes on things, so be sure to check those out as well. Also, hit the bell to get notifications when I put up new videos. I'm going to try to put one out every 1 to 2 weeks going forward. Obviously, if they are a Sunday school episode, they will go up on Sundays. Any other videos that I decide to do, I will put up the date that I plan to upload it on my social media channels, the links to which you can find in the description of this video. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.